Oh, okay.
So, in the lead up to our conference this week, I couldn't imagine a more fitting speaker and a more fitting presentation. I am honored to introduce Dr. Richard Langhorne. Dr. Langhorne was the founding director of the Division of Global Affairs and a full professor from 1996 to 2012, and is now a professorial fellow at the Division of Global Affairs. He was a director of the Center of International Studies at Cambridge University from 1982 to 1993, and a fellow of St. John's College from 1975 to 1993. He served as director of Wilton Park at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office from 1993 to 1996, and his publications included The Collapse of the Concert of Europe, The Practice of Diplomacy, The Coming of Globalization, Diplomacy, and the Essentials of Global Politics. I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Richard Langhorne. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Question of thank you for having me. And it's nice to be here, of course, after a considerable gap. Anniversaries is obviously my thing, because the last time I was here, I talked about the anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. I think we actually did it in 2015, but still it was close enough. That, of course, is a fairly gruesome and miserable thing to think about. The end of the First World War ought, perhaps, to be a pleasant thing to think about. But I'm about to read you a paper which may lead you to think that that is not necessarily so. This paper has the title 1918, The End of the War to End All Wars, which is what contemporaries decided to call it. What went wrong? So here goes. 100 years ago, on the 11th day of the 11th month at 11 a.m., not in Berlin, by the way, the most destructive war so far came to an end with a negotiated agreement to have an armistice. An armistice is a temporary cessation of hostilities, and technically speaking, the war did not end until the signature of the Treaty of Versailles, one of the Paris peace treaties, in June of 1919. In practice, it was the end of the war, because the warring parties, with one exception, were no longer able to continue fighting. In another phrase, it was a truce, compelled by mutual exhaustion and bankruptcy. The exception was the United States. The United States had joined the war against Germany only during the previous year, and done so in a way which tried to distance her from Great Britain and France, who might have been thought to be her allies, and kept her contribution focused on financing and supplying the war effort more than on military participation. The economic disruption caused by the war and its cost had essentially bankrupted the participants on both sides, and the unscathed United States became the most powerful state in the world as a result. A situation very like that to which the British Empire had succeeded after defeating Napoleon in 1815. This was to be the most important fact about the context in which the war ended, and powerfully affected the ensuing peacemaking effort. An armistice can fail and fighting resume, but in 1918-19, the only one state could have threatened to resume fighting or actually do so, and the United States neither needed nor wished to. Hence their eventual refusal either to back the settlement or join the League of Nations. Now I'm going to talk about how the war began, seen in the longest possible perspective. Seen within a long perspective, the First World War does not have the definitive and final qualities that contemporaries gave it. It looks much more like round one in a longer period of fighting, which only finally ended in the mid-1950s. It is easy to see why contemporaries thought the way most of them did. The war was begun with the expectation that, like preceding wars in the 19th century, it would be largely mobile and short. For reasons we will return to, this did not happen, and new justifications for continuing the war for a longer period had to be developed. And these tended to rest on the sins, usually humanitarian failures, of each side, mixed with some territorial ambitions, though the latter were mentioned less and less in domestic propaganda. Finally, the only idea big enough to deal with the unimaginably appalling casualty rates and allow conscription to continue to receive adequate public support was that this war must be pursued to victory in order to build a new world in which war would be outlawed forever. This intention, or anything resembling it, would only have been conceivable if the result of the war had been to remove the fundamental causes of it, and more cynically, if human nature itself could be modified while the memory of the war's physical and mental destruction remained green. These fundamental causes had little, if anything, directly to do with the assassination of the Habsburg Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, in June 1914. The assassination did, however, provide a link between profound changes in the distribution of power at two levels and the functioning of the international system at the time. The result was a breakdown and the collapse of customary behaviors which had delivered restraint for close on 100 years. The profound shifts occurred at regional levels and separately at global level. Regionally, Europe was experiencing the effects of the rise of Germany and the decay of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In East Asia, the rise of Japan, the decline of China, and the emergence of the United States as a regional power created high tensions. These together would have been enough to shake the international system, probably to its collapse. But what made that collapse certain was the slowly maturing global shift, which had already worked to some degree in advancing the power, opportunities, and relative position of the great landmass powers, for whom the improved technology of communications delivered huge advantages. This had already affected the United States and was beginning to work to the advantage of Russia, though held back by the unwieldy and often incompetent regime. A future world political system, dominated and controlled by the United States and Russia, was becoming an understood, likely future outcome. And for the beneficiaries of contemporary and quite rapid regional shifts, this outcome was a nightmare, which threatened their positions just as they were advancing to significant power and authority. The war that came in Asia in 1903 to 1905, in which Russia was defeated by Japan, was the first consequence, and the second was the war between Germany and Russia in Europe from August 1914 to February 1918, which Germany won and was certified at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, how the war ended. There remained the war on the Western Front, which had begun as a byproduct of the Russo-German struggle. If Germany had won her war with Russia in February of 1918, aided by the weakening effects of the successive revolutions in Russia in October 1917, why was she universally assumed to have lost the war in Western Europe by November 1918? In the event, Germany almost won on the Western Front too, by being able to bring reinforcements back from the east following the end of the Russian war and make one last all-out surge in an effort to break the Allied line in northern France. The line held, and then the Germans began to retreat. With no victory to show after a last throw of the dice, Germany now had to face revolutionary disorder, leading to the transition to a republic and the abdication and flight of the Emperor William II. The onset of starvation, the exhaustion of her resources generally, the collapse of her ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in October 1918, and the effects of the first serious new piece of armament since the launching of the Dreadnought-class battleship in 1906. The effect was overwhelming, and with the Allies also suffering from exhaustion, an armistice following exchanges with President Wilson and based on his 14 points was finally negotiated in France at 5 a.m. on 11 November to come into effect at 11 o'clock Paris time and 12 noon Berlin time. These actual circumstances were important because the German government believed that as they had fulfilled all the conditions asked for by the Americans, particularly including changing their system of government, the post-war settlement would be made using Wilson's 14 points as its foundation, and that they would be parties to it. The Western Allies, Britain, France and Italy, while accepting Woodrow Wilson's intentions, believed that the 14 points contained ambiguities and anticipated outcomes and methods which were impractical in the real world of international politics. They also knew of the glossary on the 14 points and other pronouncements by the President that had been prepared by Colonel House, the most influential of all the American diplomats on the scene. This glossary substantially altered the thrust of the original texts and gave some grounds for the eventual fact that 11 of the 14 points were clearly violated in the negotiations and in the treaty texts. Inevitably, when the Paris Peace Conference began, these widely varying views of what the agenda and procedures should be emerged in all their different and clashing colours. The role of an important shift in the technology of armaments in forcing Germany into an armistice was mentioned earlier, and needs to be pursued further because of its effect on the power position of the United States. The effect of the technological advances of the later 19th century extended into military equipment as effectively as into civilian infrastructures and way of life. For example, it was a major reason why there was a strong Anglo-German tension before 1914, when Germany's big problem was not the existence of the British Empire, but the rise of Russian economic and military power. The cause was to be found in naval rivalry. The technology of artillery had improved dramatically in the 30 years before 1914, so that guns had grown bigger, more accurate, with vastly longer ranges and sheer firepower. The difficulty then was that they were so heavy that they could only be used on land where a railway could take them. And the railway map of Central Europe reflects that fact to this day, particularly in Poland, where both Germany and Russia constructed strategic lines with much urgency in what were then their Polish possessions. The failure of transportation motive power to develop for use on roads in the same way as it had on rails meant that a technological gap had appeared between highly developed guns and the ability to make them mobile. It was this gap that later caused the fighting to become bogged down, literally, in trench warfare. At sea, however, there was a match. The most advanced steam power could be put into an oil-fired battleship with the most advanced navigation equipment and the most advanced naval architecture. And this combination, in the form of the newest class of Royal Navy battleships, the dreadnoughts, delivered highly agile maneuverability with the maximum possible firepower. This meant that whether a state was a significant naval power or not, the paramount importance of navies created competitive tensions autonomously. The German government took this development very seriously indeed, and despite having the biggest land forces in the world, understandable given their security needs in Europe, also began to develop a globally effective navy, something they did not need for their security. In doing so, they created an hostility between themselves and the British Empire, which had no land forces to speak of, but depended utterly on supreme naval power for its security. This is why all attempts to improve Anglo-German relations from 1901 onwards met with failure. The British merely wanted to be left alone. The Germans wanted to alarm the British into giving them an assurance of neutrality in any war in Europe, and instead managed to alarm them into making certain that they created effective defences of alliances and kept ahead in the naval construction race. Every time the British asked in relation to which country they were supposed to be neutral, the Germans were unable to say, since any answer would have been as antisocial as the real one, which was Russia and her ally France. The next development of similar magnitude came during the war in Europe, and occurred when the technology of the petrol engine was taken beyond powering pleasure cars or providing power for battleships at sea, and applied systematically to land warfare. The result was the armoured, petrol-driven tank. When it made its appearance, the gap between the quality of artillery and the quality of mobility started to be filled, and suddenly the war could become mobile and the defensive qualities of a trench virtually disappeared. The Western Allies got the tank first, and their new associate, the United States, had the resources and the ability to produce tanks in limitless quantities. If President Truman had a nuclear pistol in his pocket at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, President Wilson had an army of tanks reinforcing him at Paris, a fact he would have vehemently denied, believing that his moral positions were worth more than any military force. The German Empire did not have such resources. One young officer in France understood very early on what the future tactical consequences would be, but failed to persuade his seniors to pay attention. They put all their security eggs in an outdated basket and constructed a giant fortified trench along their eastern border with Germany called the Maginot Line. And it is an irony of history that it was to be his country that was overwhelmed by the German panzers in 1940. His name was Charles de Gaulle. Now the context of peacemaking. These factors help to explain why, despite the fact that Germany was completely intact and uninvaded at the time of the armistice, she and her new government, based initially in Weimar, were treated as defeated. More than that, it was assumed that Germany under its imperial regime was to blame for the war and therefore should be made to pay its costs in the form of reparations. On top of that burden, German territory could be regarded as a kind of Central European land bank on which checks could be drawn in order to create new national states, and Germany, therefore, reduced in size. This attitude of mind caused the so-called victors to exclude representatives from Germany at the Paris Peace Conference, which assembled in January 1919, 2 months after the fighting stopped. To be fair, this was also partly the result of an attempt to learn from history which misfired. The previous great settlement was made in Vienna in 1815, and the French, who had changed their regime after Napoleon was finally disposed of, were allowed access to the Congress and then gradually became equal members and guarantors of the treaties. In 1919, it was thought that the French should not have been allowed to achieve this, and that the Germans must not squeeze themselves in similarly. The real lesson was that Vienna lasted for 100 years and Paris lasted for less than 20. In the latter case, the Germans therefore naturally felt no responsibility for upholding the settlement and began to undermine it from the start. By the time Adolf Hitler became Chancellor, all but the territorial aspects of the settlement as it affected Germany had been dismantled, so he set about reversing the territorial damage. The moral was that if it is proposed to live with a reconstituted defeated power after a war, it is sensible to include it in any decisions about the future and make it a co-guarantor of the settlement arrived at. In the case of the 1919 settlement, there was another, equally serious absentee. Russia did not have a government that was either recognized as such by the rest of the international system or wished to be. It was not possible for her to be represented at Paris. For her, like Germany, making Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, Finland, Ukraine and Poland independent states, the return of Alsace and Lorraine to France, and the establishment of new states in the Caucasus all required amputations without consent for the operation or any anesthetic being given. Off to a bad start would be a gentle way of describing the situation 100 years ago next January. but there were equally powerful black clouds hanging in the sky. The most awkward problem occurred as a result of a series of collapses in hitherto highly significant states. Imperial Russia disappeared in 1917. The Habsburg Empire collapsed in October 1918. The Ottoman Empire effectively collapsed in 1918 and was reduced to a sliver in 1919 and dissolved in 1922. All had been multinational in character, and their collapses, particularly the Habsburg Empire, had been helped along by a contemporary attitude which had come to equate states with nationalities, to the point where if a state was not based almost entirely on one nationality, it became almost illegitimate. And if a nationality desired to be a state, it had the right to become one. The climax of these ideas came at Paris in 1919, both because the obstruction to creating nation-states in Europe and the Middle East caused by the former empires had melted away, and because one set of beliefs about the origins of the war had pointed to frustrated nationalism as a cause. The Paris Peace Conference itself. There were three principal topics that dominated the Paris Peace Conference. What to do with Germany, how to create new states that satisfied the national desires of the populations of Eastern and Central Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean also, and around the Black Sea, how to create a universal international institution that would make war impossible through its management of all future world international relations. This institution would work with a universal agreement to introduce general disarmament, which it would be responsible for achieving, together with any leftover business and contradictions in the treaties after the conference ended. The program had been generated by Wilson during the war, partly because it could provide a route by which the war could be ended, and perhaps more importantly, because it expressed the personal dogmas of Wilson himself. It was ironic that the Americans generated a semi-religious idea, not a charter or a treaty, as the Constitution of the League of Nations. This covenant was designed to remove the use or threat of military force, while the US used the fact that only they actually possessed seriously credible military force and the financial resources to support it, to insist that it be adopted over all other philosophical and practical objections expressed by others. No wonder that President Wilson found attending the conference increasingly tedious. He was eventually to complain that the manifold cartographical difficulties in fitting states to nationalities who did not live in suitably state-shaped places produced quarrelsome representatives whose shrill but detailed intrusions exhausted him. The three main topics all ended in the many treaties that made up the settlement. Few of them survived for more than about 20 years. The Treaty of Versailles, which encompassed the humiliation and defanging of Germany, was first revised in 1925 and then successively in 1932, 1936, 1938 and 1939. The Treaty of Trianon, which dealt with Hungary and instigated the loss to her of Transylvania to Romania and Slovakia to Czechoslovakia, was altered twice during the war. Disarmament was abandoned in 1932. The Treaty of Sèvres, which had emasculated the Ottoman Empire, was abandoned, and a new Turkey was accepted in the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923. The problem of creating viable national states out of the remains of former empires was at its worst in the case of what became Yugoslavia, where parts of what had been Hungary and Austria were cobbled together with Serbia and Montenegro in a state that was divided by ethnicity, history, politics and religion. The initial compromises made by the nationalities collapsed amid violence and bickering, and a dictatorship ensued. Reconstituted after the Second World War, the pressures of existing beside the Soviet Empire just about kept Yugoslavia going, but the events of 1989 and thereafter caused its complete collapse, with consequences that remain unresolved. With the exception of Czechoslovakia, All the succession states of 1918-19 failed in one way or another. The Baltic states, the Caucasian states, and Ukraine disappeared completely into the Soviet Union in 1924. Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia developed dictatorships. Political insecurity enveloped Romania and Bulgaria. In the Middle East, where the Ottoman Empire was disemboweled, the result was also unfortunate. The one success story was accomplished despite the 1919 settlement, when a resurgent nationalist Turkey emerged under Kemal Ataturk and fought its way to recognition in 1923. The problems of the Levant, from Syria to Egypt, were essentially shelved by creating League of Nations mandates held by France, Syria and Lebanon, Britain, Palestine with a duty to bring about a Jewish state, and very briefly Iraq. The results skewed previously outlined arrangements for Arab independence and postponed the other issues, and all of them continue to be the focus of violent conflict and remain so now. In the Euphrates Valley, Ottoman rule was replaced by a multinational state called Iraq, whose existence contributed to Arab frustrations. It gained full independence in the later 1920s and has swung between severe dictatorships and internal chaos ever since. In some ways, the problems about the League of Nations were neatly encapsulated by the Secretary's complaint in 1939 that a major war had started and no one had bothered even to inform the League of Nations of its outbreak. Plainly, the institution had failed in a very complete way. Given all that we now know about the conditions into which the League was launched with so much hope on board, it is easy to see that a subsequent shipwreck was inevitable. The gravity of the instabilities in the distribution of power made it improbable, even impossible, for states to allow any real influence to a body that had been carefully tailored not to have any military force of its own, despite the entreaties of the French that it should have. Any clout that the League had was located in its right to ask its members to impose sanctions on states that went into conflict without going through all the alternative routes which the League could offer. These were mainly based in international law, itself a concept without teeth, and were therefore susceptible to the objection that the great international historian Harry Hinsley pointed out: states are not usually in pursuit of their legal rights, but are instead seeking political advantages. Sanctions could be imposed and ignored or circumvented, and few episodes of proceeding via the use of sanctions have been successful, though some have contributed to bringing about change. Between the wars, sanction proved to be a hapless weapon. When in 1935, Signor Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, then Abyssinia, and gassed the Abyssinians, sanctions were imposed with some solemnity at the League of Nations. The British, for example, banned the importation of Italian straw hats, when the only credible sanction would have been to blockade Italy's oil supplies. Worse, the British and French secretly colluded to negotiate separately with Mussolini with the object of getting him to steal only half the country. If the League was inherently impractical, matters were made worse by contemporary circumstances, the chief of which was that at the outset, an institution supposedly bearing global responsibilities did not include the United States, who, having been the League's progenitor, then refused to join it. Russia was not a member, nor for different reasons was Germany. Thus, three of the most important actors in the international system were not members of the League. Germany was allowed to join in 1925, but withdrew later on. The Soviet Union eventually joined, but well beyond the point at which that could make any difference. And Japan walked out in 1932 and Italy in 1935. The lesson that no powerful state would participate in an overarching organization unless they had control of it was later acknowledged in the powers given to the permanent members of the UN Security Council. Those powers can, of course, lead to complete inaction. You wait and see what happens today about the chemical attack in Syria, as has frequently been seen, but the institution is still in existence, if in the twilight. And without that acknowledgement, it certainly would not have survived the Cold War, nor had the membership of the USSR or the USA. While so much of what was done seems willfully misdirected in retrospect, it is very hard to see how, in the stresses of the post-war situation, the popular demand for a new world order, and given the background sets of assumptions, particularly about trying to give nationalism what it wanted, anything much better could have been achieved. Moreover, it is clear that when the whole edifice of the peace was swept away just a short time later, it was not so much because of the sins of the peacemakers, and more because of their essential irrelevance. So what went wrong? Answering the question posed at the outset, did the result of the 1914 war resolve the issues that had caused it? Makes it much easier to understand this irrelevance. The war had essentially been caused by tensions arising from two major shifts in the nature and distribution of power, as we have seen, occurring simultaneously but at different speeds, regional shifts in favor of Germany and Japan, and a global shift favoring the great landmass powers. The former would be swallowed up in the latter and were determined to prevent this from happening. On the ground, this meant that Germany must stop the rise of Russia, chiefly by reducing her territory, and that Japan, who had stopped Russia regionally already in 1905, should dominate East Asia so strongly that no incursion of the United States could succeed. Of the activities of the Paris Peace Conference, only the creation of the League of Nations as part of the 1919 settlement could affect the Pacific region, at least theoretically. However, the Washington Naval Agreement of 1922 did create a temporary stability in naval armaments. The future role of Japan did not wait long to surface as an issue. In 1931, Japan invaded and effectively annexed Manchuria, a substantial part of northern China, and the League of Nations proved powerless to stop or reverse it. In 1937, a full-scale war broke out in China as the Japanese pressed their invasion further inland and further south. This war lasted until the defeat of Japan by the United States, 1941 to 45, and the question about Japan's relative power was answered. In Europe, as in Asia, it took two wars to settle the question about Germany's relative power. As has been noted, there was a mismatch between the existence of an armistice and the treatment of Germany. A more serious mismatch occurred during the conference itself. Despite the loss of pride, the loss of territory, the loss of military force, the economic loss, which was intended to flow from the payment of reparations, and the weakness of the Weimar Constitution, Germany remained the most powerful economic unit in Europe. She had ended the war in dire straits and endured catastrophic inflation in the immediate post-war years. But she had not suffered any war damage or been invaded, and her infrastructure was intact. Unlike her Western opponents, she was not facing the costs of the war in real terms. Her territorial losses hurt, but apart from Lorraine, they did not contain significant industrial or technologically advanced areas. By 1925, she had recovered, and her intrinsic power meant that she could insist on negotiations to revise the Treaty of Versailles. There was, too, a negative factor. Whereas before the war, Germany was surrounded by two large empires and a powerful France, after it, she was surrounded by a weakened France and several much smaller states. Poland, which became unstable, Czechoslovakia, which worked well and equipped itself with a formidable military force which Hitler later successfully avoided having to confront, and Austria. This last was an oddity, and one that has survived. It was denied what all other ethnic groups were being granted, that is, to become part of an ethnically German state, because no one wanted to increase the size of Weimar Germany by adding German Austria to it. It was therefore made into a small and highly unstable state on its own, but was duly absorbed into Germany in 1938 and survived after the war because the Soviet Union developed an interest in maintaining it as a bargaining chip in different matters. France did not make a rapid recovery from the massive physical destruction which the war had caused, and was slow to replace her population losses. She became a much weaker entity standing next to Germany than she had been in 1914. Across the North Sea, Britain had also been gravely damaged by the war, in people, in money, and in backbone. The treaties, perhaps inappropriately, left the British Empire larger than it had ever been or would be again, and the sheer scale of the security problems that resulted haunted successive British cabinets throughout the interwar period. Germany undoubtedly benefited from escaping the local restraints that Russia and Austria-Hungary had provided, also from the relative weakness of France and Britain, and that negative factor, combined with the positives arising from Germany's intrinsically powerful resources, would turn her into an alarming entity should her governmental system change and more disturbing revisions to the Versailles Treaty become German policy. The advent of Hitler made it certain that in the years after 1933, that is exactly what would happen, and it did. The Weimar Republic was remarkably successful in ending Germany's isolation from the international system, at avoiding complete disarmament, and at removing the obligation to pay reparations which Germany had consistently and effectively postponed. The procession of crises which Hitler induced is well known. The Rhineland was remilitarized in 1936, Austria annexed in 1938, the German population of Czechoslovakia was added to Germany in 1938 also, and with them went the defensive positions of the Czech army. In March 1939, what is now the Czech Republic was annexed by Germany, and Slovakia became an independent and semi-fascist state. At that point, Hitler's calculations went wrong. He thought that he'd been allowed to get away with annexing half a non-German state, and forgot the justification used by other governments to explain away the obvious aggression involved in German policy. This had been to say that the 1919 settlement was being revised in the interests of ethnic fairness to Germans and economic fairness to Germany. The occupation of Prague could not be so described, and that meant that other governments, specifically the British, would override the overwhelming anti-war sentiments of public opinion, and the next time Hitler created a crisis, he would be resisted by force. On the night of 31 August 1939, he invaded Poland, having done a deal with Stalin to divide it between the two of them, and found himself, to his pained surprise, opposed by the French and British governments as they successively declared war in support of Poland, support which could not rationally be delivered, so it was a principle rather than the obligations of an alliance that was being honoured. Something infinitely worse than pained surprise occurred in Moscow when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and very nearly defeated it. Napoleon and Hitler suffered the same fate. It is not a good idea to invade Russia at all, still less when the campaign is unlikely to be over before the winter. Stalin took pleasure in the comparison. In 1949, the British Field Marshal General Bernard Montgomery telegraphed Stalin to congratulate him on taking Berlin in May 1945. Stalin thanked him and observed accurately that in May 1814, we were in Paris. The we is significant. Stalin did not distinguish Tsarist rule from his rule when it came to Russian interests in foreign policy and war, a fact never understood, or at least not completely, in Washington. It is reasonably obvious from the above discussion that the Second World War after 1941 was a continuation of the First, and that it was about the same issues. Germany rose from the ashes of 1918-19 and saw the chance of a second try at restraining and hobbling Russia. And Hitler, in his wilder moments, foresaw a forthcoming need to do the same thing to the United States. He too, like his predecessors in 1914, wanted to prevent Germany from being overtaken by the great landmass power to its east and absorbed into its global sphere. Finally, how should the end of the First War and the settlement be regarded? There are two levels to consider. The first is, as noted above, that it probably did not matter much what the conference did and what the terms of its many treaties were. If the purpose was to restrain Germany permanently, adequate military force would be needed to back up the treaty provisions. Military force, its use either as a threat or in reality, was simply not an option that public opinion would accept until Hitler made it so in 1939. Something that Neville Chamberlain's notorious missions in 1938 made very clear. The French government was particularly apt to demand that Germany be made to observe the Treaty of Versailles, and attributed the rising tensions of the 1930s to a failure to do this. But they were no more able to make a credible threat to use force than any of the other parties. So both long-term flows of change and the immediate situation on the domestic political ground were simultaneously creating a context in which the initial Wilsonian assumptions of the conference, whether of the negotiators or their political masters, were located in fantasy land. But it was a fantasy land constructed by public opinion, comprehensible after the most destructive and shocking war so far seen. The second level concerns the way in which the fighting stopped and the ambiguous situation that followed in respect of Germany. The proceedings and decisions of the ensuing conference also contributed to the tensions of the 1920s and 30s and the return of warfare after 1931. There are two particularly useful accounts of it by two men who were there. There are many others, but they are mainly self-justificatory. Harold Nicholson served on the British delegation and was at the time a rising star at the Foreign Office, but also a writer and politically engaged, and he left the Foreign Service soon after the conference. He had an outsider's eye and wrote an account called Peacemaking 1919, which remains the best published source. Another, subsequently even more famous figure, was part of the British Treasury team, John Maynard Keynes, and he published a description of the four main participants in a collection of biographical pieces called Essays in Biography. He pulled no punches, and President Wilson, Mr. Lloyd George, Monsieur Clemenceau, and Signor Orlando emerged with a brutal clarity verging on contempt. Some of the problems faced at Paris were inevitable. The complexities of constructing the new states and the presence and lobbying of their leaders were both in different ways and too many people around. The swirling emotions provoked by the war, particularly the anxieties of the French and the belief that Germany had caused the war and behaved badly during it, could not be tamed, nor could the hope-filled expectations of the general public. However, a feature that need not have happened probably produced the greatest difficulty. Initially, the conference was planned to be like its predecessors. That is to say, that the parties would send expert teams reporting to foreign ministers and heads of government at home. This method allows for compromises to be made at one remove from the pressures of elective office and the flows of public opinion. Time to think can be gained by the need to consult governments at home, and the ultimate decision-making by heads of government is not immediately available if they are not sitting in the next door room, which of course they were. At Paris they were doing just that, and the reason was that Woodrow Wilson had decided to attend the conference in person. It then followed that the other heads of government had to be there as well. The one advantage of his being there might have been that the US acceptance of the result would be more likely. But his absence from Washington in practice cut him off from a growingly hostile approach becoming general in and outside Congress, and the US eventually jumped ship. On the ground in Paris, his presence caused an aura of dogmatic insistence to develop. It came coupled with substantial ignorance of the demographic, geographical, and political issues involved, and Wilson became lost in the frequent disputes with the other heads of government, and his self-awarded role as a kind of messiah rapidly lost credibility. One damaging example of this was that Wilson believed that if a state had once been called an empire, it must have been evil and undemocratic. His hostility towards Germany was partly based on this assumption, and it did not occur to him that Imperial Germany had in fact been a functioning democracy. The only statesman who foresaw what the result of maltreating Germany and its new governing system would be was David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he expressed his misgivings in a famous but late intervention in March 1919. It is known as the Fontainebleau Memorandum, because that's where it was written, and naturally incurred the opposition of France, who wanted the Germans emasculated forever. But for Wilson, ever suspicious of Germany, yet the purported bringer of peace, it only, quotes, made me feel very tired. Eventually, Wilson had to resort to a device to enable an ending to be reached. Disputes remaining and other unfinished business would be left to the League of Nations to resolve. But as already discussed, the League as it emerged was seriously unrepresentative, organisationally untidy, and possessed of no real power to act. The unfortunate results of saddling the new organisation with an impossible set of problems right at the outset were entirely predictable and inevitably prolonged. The fundamental realities of the global distribution of power would have made whatever was decided at Paris temporary. But the combination of factors discussed above made the outcome more difficult to arrive at and less realistic than might have been so. This was particularly true of the German settlement and of the League of Nations. On the other hand, the expert demographic and geographical work, although altered to some extent in 1945, largely survived in Europe, though not elsewhere. In the end, the whole sequence of events from the armistice of 11th November 1918 to the end of the peace conference on 21st January 1920 merely introduced a pause in global conflict. Good things were meant to happen, but were overwhelmed by grinding inevitabilities. It was a classic Greek tragedy. The field is now yours. So please fire away. Norman.
Richard, the tension between the nation state and various forms of international and global organization has been a basic leitmotif of the global studies program, which you so wisely and so well started. But listening to you about the aftermath of World War I and contemplating today's headlines, and in particular the deaths in the Middle East, do you think there's room for lamenting the rise of nationalism in the first place and nostalgia for the great empires, in particular the Ottomans, today?
Well, yes, there is room for some of that. I do think there is room for some of that. Like many ideas that flourished to the point of becoming an obsession, and this was one of them, the outcome can sometimes actually act against the wishes of the people who first had the obsession. And I do think that happened in the case of nationalism. The inherent problem is the one I did mention. Not all nationalities live in state-shaped territories. And Yugoslavia is, of course, the classic example of that, but so is Iraq. So is Iraq. And there are other ones. And if the obsession has reached a point of saying it's got to be like that, then the tergiversations of achieving it work against themselves. And again, Yugoslavia and Iraq are both very good examples of that happening. So it's perfectly understandable that the populations will have feelings about themselves, which can be called nationalism. But it hasn't always been true in history that the connection between an organized state and the presence of a single or at most two nationalities within it has been so. The state arrived before nationalism did. The state is a product of the 16th and 17th century in Europe. And for 200 years at least, there was no idea that an organized state had to contain a definite nationality. that only came after 1815, and actually the people who made the settlement in 1815 thought it was a wicked idea and attempted to put barriers in its way. But the barriers were pulled down gradually, and this particular notion that if you had too many nationalities in your state, it meant that you weren't really legitimate, and that if you were a nationality that wanted to be a state, then you must do so. And during the 19th century, the Italians did it. They like to say that they did it Italia fava da se, which means we did it ourselves. They didn't. Alan Taylor once remarked that Italy is the only state in the world which has ever supposed that the acquisition of territory should follow defeat in war. Roughly speaking, that's what happened to Italy. And Germany made it a kind of middle range, and if only it had gone further, it might have taught people some things. Thing happened to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which got that name because the Hungarians succeeded in getting autonomy within the empire. And that was in 1867. But it is all part of the we are Hungarian and we must have a proper Hungarian state. Hungarians were rather firm-minded about that and didn't at all like the idea that you might be Slovakian and not like Hungarians very much, or you might be Romanian living in Transylvania and not like Hungarians very much, but we'll leave that on one side. So there was some development in the 19th century towards doing this, but the obsession came to the surface in maximum force from January 1919 onwards. And the chaos caused by the leaders, who of course intended to become president or prime minister, what was done, they all showed up in Paris. And sometimes they disagreed violently between themselves. I mean, can you see the Hungarians and the Romanians having anything other than intense hostility, which they did? And then there were other problems which were caused by the fact that during the war, the impending collapse of the Ottoman Empire was understood about and thought to be inevitable, and therefore treaties were made to the benefit of Greece and to the benefit of Italy particularly, which assigned to them, you won't believe this if you didn't know it already, large portions of what is now Turkey, Anatolia. Greece was to have the coast because traditionally, a very long time ago, like 1,000 years or so, it was Greek. And the Italians were also to be given a bit, and it was just unfortunate that the same bit was assigned to them both in separate treaties during the First World War. And then, of course, in the event, neither of them got it, because Kemal Ataturk expelled the Greeks, it has to be said, with extreme force and death and so forth. And this, of course, is what still fuels Greco-Turkish hostility. You must know it exists. They're having a huge row at the moment. So there we are. That didn't help when it came to the making of the new maps. But as I said, the work that was done on that was as good as it could be. And it's very difficult to see what else you could have done in the Balkans. And they did have some sense, which we no longer have for reasons which are another discussion, that independent Serbia, independent Croatia, independent Montenegro, so they thought then that those were unviable. And in the circumstances of 1919-20, they would have been unviable. But things have changed. You don't have to be big in the modern environment to be a viable entity. The communications revolution and other factors have seen to that. But in 1919, that was thought to be impossible. So it all had to be cobbled together. But the sheer size and scale of the differences, I suppose they don't surprise certainly a modern audience who lived through the events in Yugoslavia post-1989. Cannot be in any doubt about the scale of the hostilities and the religious differences and so forth. I mean, who would be a Bosnian, really? But but there it was. They did cobble it together. And there was an initial agreement between the nationalities, but then it turned out that what that actually meant was that Yugoslavia was going to be run by the Serbs.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to ask first, can we have access to your presentation materials? So
I have 20 copies. And
then my second question, I study the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I'm trying to find out your perspective. Vilnius, Vilna, the capital of Lithuania, had history before, in the medieval times, was occupied by Lithuanians before. Over the years, Russia and Poland, their population became more. So after the First World War, the population of the Polish population within the locality was so high, maybe about 30%, and that of Lithuanians was little less than 5%. So when Lithuania was established, they naturally wanted Vilnius to be their capital, but the League of Nations couldn't persuade the Polish to give up the territory. So in light of that, if you look at what is happening within the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Jewish people said originally this territory were ours. So does this set any form of precedence, or what is your perspective, or is it like a leitmotif that nations or local or groups who originally had access to a particular territory, and then when the dynamics change, do they have any precedent or any right to demand that this territory belongs to us?
well, that became the view from the Balfour Declaration onwards. And when Great Britain was given the mandate for Palestine, it came with the notion that it had got to be a preparatory thing to the creation of a Jewish state. And that obviously had to be a recognition of something that actually hadn't existed for a very, very, very long time. And there was a Jewish population in Palestine because, interestingly, it's not, I think, widely understood, the Ottoman Empire encouraged Jewish immigration into Palestine as part of an effort to counter growing Arab nationalism. They wanted a counterweight to it. So there was an existing Jewish population in Palestine, but basically, of course, it was to be created for Jews to immigrate to. In that sense, it is different from when you quote the Polish-Lithuanian situation. It is different from trying to deal with exactly what was on the ground, which they had to do with the others. But as you know, the British mandate ended, and they didn't succeed in creating a Jewish state, and that came only after the Second World War. So I think it is a bit different. But the basic idea that it should be created because it had in the past been where the Jewish people lived isn't wildly different from the others. But it is different because of the time scale. Yes, please.
Yes. Is peace possible if there is not a clearly defeated a loser?
Probably not. But I would rephrase that, and I think I was sort of trying to say that in saying that you're not going to get a peace that lasts any length of time unless the result of the war is actually to solve the things that caused it. Now, you could have an end of the war which didn't lead to the complete collapse of one of the warring parties, leave the situation suitably resolved. There are one or two examples of that from the 18th century, for example. The 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, was a bit like that. But signally and obviously, The situation in 1919 or 1918 was not like that, and you get this mismatch between the public view that after something as shocking and horrible as the First World War had been, that it must be possible to create a situation in which it could never be repeated, comes up against and doesn't match the realities of the situation, which was that the war, nasty though it was, had actually solved nothing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
At the end of the First World War, Germany was completely defeated. And I know you mentioned that there were lack of resources that was partly why the battle came to an end, but Germany had to pay war reparations.
She never did.
It never did. It was supposed to.
Yeah, it was supposed to.
Was
yes.
supposed to.
Yes.
Was supposed to pay war reparations, and Germany accepted defeat. In that, it's true that possibly the humiliation that remained and the fact that it remained the story remained among the generations. Hitler himself, for example, was affected by it. Perhaps it's not the fact that the war, Germany was not completely defeated, but the fact that the humiliation remained that initiated the Second World War, possibly. And the other thing is that when you compare it to today, would you say that the nature of war has changed significantly in many ways? For example, we know currently that despite serious tensions right now that could have possibly led to a conflict in 19th century or early 20th century between Iran, US, Russia, even Syria, for example, there
Yes.
is a proxy war that is going on in the Middle East, but it has never transformed into a direct battle.
Right,
And
so.
so the nature of war in that sense has changed, so it is hard to say there would be a winner and loser. Also, now we see the information war that is transforming, and also we see the economic wars that are being fought. So I think, and that's to refer to the previous question, whether there should be a direct battle between the two conflicting parties to lead to peace. I think there has to be some questioning in that particular argument.
Yes, the nature of war has absolutely changed, and it has done so steadily. And through the 20th century, warfare, statistically speaking, was greatly reduced. And what was happening was that the onset of important technological change made it more expensive, more dangerous to go to war. So states became more reluctant to go to war. But when they did, of course, they had the whole array of technologically advanced stuff. And so the war was awful and got awfuler. In that sense, there has been a change, and that helps to explain why you get more proxy wars. But there wasn't. We're dealing now, when you speak of information wars, I think economic conflicts are not seriously different from what they've been. But the wars that get conducted in a hands-off sort of way, through social media and all the things that get so much discussed now, that is a new thing. But I wouldn't change my view that whatever vehicle is being used to conduct conflict, you will not get a period of peace in the terms of that vehicle unless what happens resolves the initial cause of having a conflict at all. So yes, absolutely, the way in which a conflict is managed now, it has changed a lot. I'm sure it will change more. One interesting consequence, I mean, you speak of these proxy wars and so forth, and you're absolutely right. But what we have seen is almost a reversion to a style of warfare which is more characteristic of the later Middle Ages than Europe and in the 16th century. By which I mean much smaller scale, often much more amateur in the way that it's done. I mean, the Yugoslav conflict of, 20 years ago or so. You've got people behaving as if they got a trebuchet or something, just chucking something explosive off a hill outside Sarajevo to land in the middle of it. Well, that's what you would have done in 1500. So there is quite a lot of reduction in scale. And that again is because if you really take to the high-tech stuff, you're likely to get into a situation which you can't handle. Now, the current situation in Syria is a little bit like that. It's small scale. I mean, it doesn't seem so because of the news, but looked at realistically, it is small scale. And it has been conducted in a series of sieges. Well, you know, Henry VIII would have understood about that. But then again, it's mixed up with modernity because there have been several now episodes of using weapons that we all thought had been banned, and that ban was accepted. So there is something different there, no question. But basically I agree with what you said, absolutely. But I don't say that it's different now, and that you don't need to have or won't get conflicts in some way or another that don't resolve the causes. There has to be resolution of the causes, and it really doesn't matter what the vehicle is. So,
speaking of the nature of war, so how would you characterize the U.S. foreign policy during World War I and World War II compared to Afghanistan?
Yeah, the big difference between the two. The United States, I would have thought, certainly from its point of view, handled the business of the First World War in Europe pretty well. What happened after the war but the more you look at it, gets to look like episodes of such severe irresponsibility that it's hard to accept it. For example, just to take the one example of Japan, the United States could have, in the 1920s and 30s, prevented the Japanese from expanding, but they wouldn't do it. Now, that has to be partly because of domestic political considerations, but also from a belief that they didn't need to. But the business about, well, we don't need to, is loosely connected to the idea of American exceptionalism. There was a particular example, again, using the same field, but there was a major conference in Brussels, which was called at the time that the Japanese seriously invaded southern China. And that was the beginning of the Second World War. Right. The Second World War began in China in 1937 and ended in Japan in 1945, if continuous fighting is a definition of war. And the United States attended the Brussels conference, but wouldn't attend it as a member, only as an observer. And as the only state really concerned in it, it was a piece of extraordinary irresponsibility. So I think that was the difference, it led to the situation where the Japanese decided that they had an opportunity to go for gold, as it were, because and had begun to believe that it was possible that the United States would actually not resist them, or could be knocked sufficiently hard that it would then decide not to resist them. So they then orchestrated their huge invasion of the whole of the East Asian and Southeast Asian area and whacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. The result of all that was, of course, inevitable, but it need not have happened like that. And I also think there was a certain irresponsibility about refusing to join the League of Nations. It wasn't in the United States' interest not to. It would have done, of course, had there been an effective Russia. That's the difference between 1919 and 1945. In 1945, the United States was going to join the United Nations, whatever, because the Soviet Union was. In 1919, the League of Nations didn't have Russia, and nobody supposed it could have, and nobody knew in 1919 who could possibly represent Russia. So Russia's just not there. And the United States, understandably, but unfortunately, read that as meaning that their security was so secure that it didn't need any buttressing. Does that make sense at all?
It does. Thank you.
Oh, lots of people. Who did it first? Did either of you? Yes? You go first.
Okay. Like, as a British political scientist, I just want to know your opinion on the way that this Cambridge Analytica in Britain is like involved in U.S. elections when they and harvest.
Yes. Could we leave that one and talk
Okay.
about that a little bit later?
Okay.
Natalie, is that all right?
Yes.
Yes. I think we should stick to the consequences of the First World War and the centenary that we are.
Yeah, I just want to know some.
No, we can talk about that. Not that I know very much about Cambridge Analytica. I suspect my college may have helped to found it, but that is that is another issue. So,
why didn't U.S. actively ensure security of Europe after World War I?
sorry, I didn't understand the question. Why did the U.S.
actively ensure the security of Europe after World War I by using its maximum power, although it had enough capability as a superpower?
Yes. The United States was really so keen to pack its bags and go home that it didn't understand the depth of economic disruption, because it was actually a beneficiary of that. That was the case in Europe. So nobody sat around in 1919 saying, look, we need a Marshall Plan. I mean, it just didn't occur to anybody. The United States was more interested in sending rude communications to London and Paris saying, when are you going to pay your debts? To which the answer was, when the Germans pay theirs. And that didn't happen. And that whole nexus was what brought the Great Depression to Europe. With the constant trying to get the debts circulate, stop the circulation, and it was still circulating. And it carried the Great Depression to Europe in a way that it might otherwise not have done. And that, of course, leads to a possible speculation that Hitler might not have made it in those circumstances. However, that is a different subject. But I mean, I see what you mean. A really realistic President or Secretary of State in 1919 would have said the best possible security for us is the most prosperous and well-organized Europe. But they didn't. Are you signaling? Yes.
I was wondering how to make the lessons of World War I and diplomacy from that inter-war period more appealing to a global audience. Because of course in the UK you have such a cultural permeation of everything from Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen and Blackadder goes
Yes,
forward.
of course. Yes.
It's such a legacy
Yes.
that we can extend it and link mustard gas then to Syria now. But how to extend it from that emotional touchstone to an intellectual one that doesn't just seem like European intellectual imperialism.
Yeah, as in the really incorrect, it's just a European civil war. You don't have civil war when what you're concerned with is global power. No, I take your point. If the war had gone on a little bit longer, and there had therefore been a much bigger United States military involvement, then that would have changed things. It does remain true, however, that the American nerve can be touched when you think about the sinkings. I mean, there is that bit of it. I don't know how you could do what you suggest, really. I don't think well, I can't think how to get a kind of basic understanding of what actually happened during the war across here, how it could be done. Maybe you should try. But it is a difficulty. It is a difficulty. All societies, but possibly this one more than most, have a habit of seeing what they want to see.
Thanks for the presentation, Prof. You mentioned something along the line in trying to answer what went wrong. I am thinking in terms of what can potentially go wrong now, in terms of when you look at the Security Council and as an organ within the UN, when most of these powerful nations, including the US, that are somehow involved in proxy wars in other territories, what is the future and what potentially can go wrong in terms of war and in terms of the relevance of this organization to prevent and land for
yes. Well, I think you've got two things. One is what can be done, if anything, about an increasing general sense of conflict in the world, and I agree that there is such. I do not agree with one way of describing that, which is to say, oh dear, this feels just like before 1914. It doesn't. I really don't think that operates. I mean, you could say, well, 1914 has a lot to do with frustrated nationalisms in the Balkans. But as I hope you feel I said, that was just a mechanism whereby much more significant shifts got expressed. It wasn't the cause of the war, it was the occasion for the war. Now, if you look at things now, can you see any of the kinds of conflicts that we now have going on, and at so many different levels of management, as it were, as representing some sort of a broad shift that's going on? Because if so, then there will develop some kind of link. These things will become the occasion for expressing something else. But I don't see that at the moment, but I could be entirely wrong. What is immediately in front of one's nose can be very unclear. And just like the people in 1919 had no idea that somebody 100 years later was going to write a paper saying they were irrelevant. They thought that they were going to create a completely new world. So take care, I think, about that. Now, about the United Nations, it's a hopeless case. There is nothing further to be said. I'm not saying that mistakes were made in 1944-45 when it was born, and the notion that you must have special position for the specially powerful is correct. You are just not going to have anything if you don't have that. But then the consequence of that is that the specially powerful behave badly, and they're doing so right now. So I think not to expect too much. The history of the United Nations suggests strongly that it's not able to perform a major political role. It cannot prevent wars or reverse their consequences. It can, however, act as a general exchange point for all sorts of global activities. It's coordination of aid and so forth, and help in terrible circumstances. We need it, but we have to accept that it was actually put there to control conflict and warfare, and it can't. So it has evolved a bit into something that does something else, for which we should be grateful. And, may I say in this country, be prepared to pay for. Now, yes, please.
I think, just adding on to his question, I wanted to ask whether you would say that the nation state, the system of nation states will continue or will sustain in the...
No, it's a very, very interesting question. I mean, it really is. And I wonder if we ought, if you don't mind, to postpone that in case anybody has got questions more directly related to my paper. If we've run out of those, then by all means, can we have a slight break and then change over? Yes? Well, you know, you've both had to go. Anybody who hasn't? Please.
It's great to see you, Professor.
Hello.
I'm trying to kind of counter this topic and what gentlemen asked about winning and losing sides. And how do we measure who's winner, who's loser? And what time frame we should use it as a measuring stick? Does it short-term appearance of winning actually on the long term can be demise? And in your opinion, should countries and diplomats be pragmatic, or should they be more kind of aggressive in pursuing kind of a different methods?
Well, yes, I see what you mean. First of all, on the subject of diplomacy, there is a relationship between what was said about, well, what about states? Is slightly, not even slightly, but it's off beam in the sense that it is entirely designed to represent the interests of states. Okay? If you have a world in which states are comparatively weakening, then, and we have only one system, the diplomatic system, for exchanging all the things we want to exchange, the conversations we want to have with other units of power, it's missing the dartboard, so to speak, but not by a huge amount. It's still useful. States still do things, but it's inadequate now as the sole mechanism, and because of that, other things are happening to plug the gaps. And I expect what will happen is that over time the plugs will become more important and constitute the system, but without removing the diplomatic structure that we've got, but perhaps downgrading it in its general significance. And it is related to the issue about what role states play, and we can come back and talk about that a bit more. Winning a war and then realizing that you lost it happens, of course it does. Contemplate the enormous defeat that Japan inflicted on Russia in 1905. I mean, that would be a classic example. And that was the beginning of a process that ended with the complete collapse of Japan in 1945. So yes, that can absolutely happen. Yeah. More? Yes, please.
You mentioned the sinkings like the Lusitania, but I was wondering, in your opinion, how much the Zimmerman telegram contributed to the American bomb?
Yes. That's been a row that's been, well, not a row, but a calculation that people have tried to make for, what, 100 and something years now. I think it can only be a matter of opinion. The sinkings did something to public opinion. The Zimmerman telegram did something to official opinion, and I think there was a combination. The whole story of the Zimmerman telegram is wonderful reading, and I'm sure you know there are good books about it, and how it all happened and so forth. And both of them certainly had an effect, yes.
You mentioned the case of Serbia and Iraq. If divide and rule is part of the political international relations, why Iraq was created?
Fundamentally because nobody knew what to do. It was quite clear that the continuation of Ottoman rule could not happen. Iraq, what is now Iraq, and the districts, areas of it, had been included in wartime discussions about what to do to provide an Arab state. which the removal of the Ottoman Empire obviously meant had to be discussed. And a huge muddle developed, a bit like what happened to Anatolia, that various people had stirred the Arab pot, one of them being Lawrence of Arabia, but not only. And some understandings were reached during the war, and that's not what actually happened after the war, because chiefly the French were determined to increase their influence in the Eastern Mediterranean and demanded and got what were called League of Nations mandates. Now, those things were intended to be temporary. The atmosphere of the time was against, quotes, colonialism, so nobody wanted these attributions of territory to be so described, so they invented the idea that they were actually league territories who were mandated to a country that could administer pro tem for the time being. And failure to agree about what to do in the Eastern Mediterranean meant that mandates were given. And the French were given a mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Now, Syria was supposed to have been part of a solution to creating an Arab state, but it wasn't there to do that with. Then there was the problem, which during the war, well, until the Balfour Declaration in 1917, calculations about that had not included the idea that there would definitely be a Jewish state. The idea of having a Jewish state had been around for a long time, but not necessarily that it should be in Palestine. But that came to the fore. So I think what you've got is people desperately trying to find something that would make viability a viable unit in the Euphrates and Tigris valleys. And so what was a deeply divided, and remains a deeply divided set of societies, were put into one, Iraq. The British were asked to supervise it to begin with, which they did for just a few years. First time air power was ever used to fight a rebellion. Quite interesting in that respect. The Royal Air Force didn't quite exist, but something its predecessor did, and it was used to bomb, and what a familiar phrase, it was used to bomb the Kurds. So I mean, I think that is the answer. I think Mr. Churchill, as quite often, put it rather well. He described the 1919 Paris conference as a turbulent collision of embarrassed demagogues. Good.
Just a quick just a quick announcement. We have a lunch reception from 12:45 for Dr. Langhorne.
Okay, well, we can go on till 12:45, because behind you there was a question.
So very quickly, some students do have to get to class, so we have time for one more question.
All right, well, you've got it.
Stefan, nice to see you again. Before the nation-state ascendancy in the second part of 1800s, empire was the most viable entity out there. An empire would be multinational, multilinguistic, multicultural, multi-confessional, or religious, and it was a loose association of the conquered peoples that had a lot of space for their autonomies.
Yes.
We talk about the Ottoman Millet, or the Swedish Empire across the Baltics, or other such, even the Austro-Hungarian. That changes with the onset of nation-state formations, as you've said. Do we have a comparable potentiality of seeing that again return without the terminology we had 200 years ago? Whether it's in regions, as you aptly say, Euphrates and Tigris and broader wide Near East, is it the Balkans in the context of ex-Yugoslavia and some other such places? whereby we don't have perhaps one dominant group dominating others, which is what happens with empires, well, two Austro-Hungarians, but that's short-lived.
Yes.
Is that coming back, or was that the EU, which today is, well, what is it becoming?
Yes. Well, I was going to say that thinking of what you're outlining, the first thing that came to my mind was the EU. I suppose it's the Greeks who have most frequently pointed out that they think that the EU has imperial desires because of the way they were treated. I don't think that actually is the case. It's a very interesting point. It is related, obviously, to the question of what do we think is going to happen to the commonly accepted version of a state, isn't it? And it is clear that that commonly accepted version is, in some ways, on the way out. And the sooner people can get a handle on that, the sooner things will improve in all sorts of ways. And yes, it might lead to something where you have overarching but rather mild management and a huge degree of autonomy underneath it. I think that would be, in a way, it would be more Ottoman than anything else. That, I think, is true. But it also would be different from, say, the British Empire or Austria-Hungary. It would be much more like the Holy Roman Empire in the Middle Ages. And that, there are historians who do feel that this is a reasonable thing to say, and such people describe the modern world as a return to medievalism. Now, that won't do really at all, because medieval Europe may have been a very significant place and a very interesting place. But what is the use of talking to an East Asian about medieval Europe? It won't do, I think, as a template for something which is essentially global. It's happening all over. And it leads to all sorts of difficulties, which we can talk about, but we'll stop.
Thank you so much, Dr. Langhorne, for sharing your paper and taking our students' questions. If you had a question and didn't have a chance to ask it, we will be having a lunch reception in room 233 at 12:45 to 1:45. So please stop by. And
anybody wants a copy?
And we will also distribute the copies. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.